At 21:47 on the night of January 12, 1941, Flight Lieutenant Richard Stevens crouched in the cockpit of his Bristol Beaufighter, watching the darkness over the English Channel through eyes his commanding officer had called worthless 18 months earlier. 26 years old, exceptional night vision, 0 kills. The Germans had 400 bombers operating over Britain that night, and in the past 6 weeks they had killed 13,000 civilians in London alone. Stevens had been told his natural night vision was useless in modern warfare. His squadron leader at RAF Tangmere had said radar was the future, and pilots who relied on their eyes were dinosaurs. When Stevens had demonstrated his ability to read navigation charts in near-total darkness during training at RAF Cranwell in 1939, the medical officer wanted to study him. Stevens explained it was nothing special. His father had been a poacher in Northumberland. His grandfather had been a poacher. 3 generations of men who hunted deer and rabbits in the hills at night without torches, without moon, without anything except their eyes and their patience. The examining physician called it a curiosity. The Royal Air Force called it irrelevant. Stevens graduated flight training in March 1940 with average marks and was posted to 29 Squadron flying Bristol Blenheims. The squadron was equipped with the first-generation aircraft interception radar called AI Mark III. The sets were experimental, temperamental, and required a dedicated radar operator to interpret the cathode ray tube displays. Stevens flew with Sergeant Peter Walsh, a former wireless operator who had volunteered for the new radar program. Walsh was competent, careful, and honest. He told Stevens the truth on their 3rd patrol together. The radar sets failed more often than they worked. On their first 20-night patrols between June and October 1940, Stevens and Walsh intercepted exactly 0 German aircraft. The AI Mark III had a maximum range of 3 miles, in perfect conditions. In practice, the sets overheated after 90 minutes. The displays showed ground clutter that made interpretation nearly impossible. The antennas iced over at altitude, and the whole system required so much electrical power that it drained the Blenheim's batteries within 2 hours. Other crews were having the same problems. The entire RAF night fighter force had shot down fewer than 20 German bombers in the first 4 months of the Blitz. The Luftwaffe was operating with near impunity. Every night, hundreds of German bombers crossed the Channel, dropped their load on British cities, and flew home without seeing a single British fighter. If you want to see how Stevens turned his so-called worthless night vision into a weapon against the Luftwaffe, please hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten stories with more people. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Stevens. On October 23, 1940, Stevens was flying a patrol over Kent when Walsh's radar set failed completely. Smoke started pouring from the unit. Walsh shut it down and told Stevens they should return to base. Stevens kept flying. The moon was new. Cloud cover was scattered at 8,000 feet. Visibility was poor, but not 0. German bombers were active that night. Stevens could hear them on the radio. Ground control was vectoring other night fighters toward contacts, but without radar, none of the fighters could close to visual range. Stevens climbed to 12,000 feet and turned east toward the Channel. He was flying by instinct now, using the same methods his father had taught him. At 21:34, he saw it, a shape darker than the darkness around it. 800 yards away, slightly below, moving west. The silhouette was wrong for a British bomber. Too large, wrong engine configuration. Stevens identified it as a Heinkel, He-111. He closed to 400 yards before the German crew spotted him. The Heinkel's rear gunner opened fire. Tracer rounds arced past Stevens' Blenheim. Stevens waited. 300 yards, 200 yards. The rear gunner was firing blind, spraying rounds into the darkness, hoping to hit something. Stevens could see the muzzle flashes clearly. He could see the bomber's outline. He could see the crew moving in the cockpit. At 150 yards, he opened fire with the Blenheim's 4.303 Browning machine guns. The guns were mounted under the fuselage. Stevens had practiced firing them hundreds of times during daylight training, but this was different. At night, the muzzle flash from his own guns destroyed his night vision temporarily. He fired a 2-second burst, then stopped. His eyes readjusted. The Heinkel was still there, trailing smoke from the port engine. The rear gunner had stopped firing. Stevens closed to 100 yards and fired again. This burst was longer, 4 seconds. He walked the rounds along the bomber's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The Heinkel's port engine burst into flames. The bomber rolled left and began spiraling down. Stevens did not follow. He knew the bomber was finished. He turned northwest and headed back toward the coast. Walsh was staring at him. Stevens told him to log the kill. Walsh asked how he had found the bomber without radar. Stevens said he had seen it. Walsh said that was impossible. Stevens said his father would disagree. They landed at RAF West Malling at 2021. Stevens filed his combat report. The intelligence officer questioned him for 30 minutes about the intercept. How had he located the bomber without radar assistance? How had he tracked it in total darkness? How had he identified it as hostile? Stevens explained again. He had seen it. His eyes were adapted to darkness. The intelligence officer wrote, "Pilot claims exceptional night vision" in the report, and forwarded it to headquarters. 3 days later, Stevens was summoned to RAF Bentley Priory, the headquarters of Fighter Command. Air Vice Marshal Sholto Douglas wanted to meet the pilot who had shot down a German bomber without radar. Douglas was direct. He asked Stevens if the kill was legitimate or if he had gotten lucky. Stevens said it was legitimate. Douglas asked if he could repeat the intercept. Stevens said yes, if the conditions were similar. Douglas said the RAF was desperate for any solution to the German night bombing campaign. The radar sets were improving but still unreliable. Pilots who could operate without radar were valuable. He assigned Stevens to 604 Squadron, one of the few units equipped with the new Bristol Beaufighter. The Beaufighter was faster than the Blenheim, better armed, and carried the improved AI Mark IV radar. But Stevens was not being assigned because of the radar. He was being assigned because he could fight without it. Stevens reported to 604 Squadron at RAF Middle Wallop on November 3, 1940. The squadron was commanded by squadron leader John Cunningham, who would become famous as Cat's Eyes Cunningham, the RAF's most successful night fighter pilot. Cunningham's success was attributed to radar, but he also understood the value of pilots who could see in the dark. He paired Stevens with Flight Sergeant James Harper, an experienced radar operator who had trained on the AI Mark IV systems. Harper was skeptical when he learned about Stevens's first kill. He told Stevens that night fighting without radar was impossible. The sky was too big, the targets too small, the darkness too complete. Stevens said they would see. Their first patrol together was on November 8, 1940. The Germans were bombing Coventry. Ground control vectored Stevens toward multiple contacts north of London. Harper's radar picked up a target at 4 miles. He guided Stevens toward the contact, calling out ranges and bearings. At 1 mile, the radar return strengthened. At half a mile, Harper said he should have visual contact. Stevens saw nothing on his instruments. The radar showed a solid contact 800 yards ahead. Stevens stared into the darkness. Then he saw it. Not with his instruments, with his eyes. A faint shape against the stars. He told Harper he had visual contact. Harper asked where. Stevens pointed. Harper could not see anything. Stevens closed to 400 yards. The shape resolved into a Dornier Du 17. The bomber the Luftwaffe called the Flying Pencil because of its narrow fuselage. The Dornier was cruising at 15,000 feet, steady course, no evasive maneuvers. The crew had not spotted the Beaufighter. Stevens positioned himself 200 yards behind and below the bomber. The Beaufighter carried 4 20mm Hispano cannons mounted in the belly. Each cannon could fire 600 rounds per minute. One burst would be enough. Stevens fired at 150 yards. The cannons produced more muzzle flash than the Blenheim's machine guns. For 2 seconds, Stevens was blind, his night vision completely destroyed by the brilliant yellow flames erupting from under his aircraft. When his eyes readjusted, the Dornier was burning. The entire rear fuselage was engulfed in flames. The bomber rolled over and fell. Stevens pulled up and turned west. Harper was silent. They landed at Middle Wallop at 22:47. Ground control confirmed the kill. Radar tracks showed a German bomber disappearing from their screens at the exact time and location Stevens had engaged. It was Stevens' second confirmed kill. Cunningham called Stevens into his office the next morning. He asked Stevens to explain his technique. Stevens said there was no technique. His eyes were adapted to darkness. He could see things other pilots could not see. Cunningham asked if this ability could be taught. Stevens said no. It was something you were born with or learned as a child. If you had not developed it by adulthood, you never would. Cunningham understood. He told Stevens he would be given priority for patrols during periods when radar was less effective. New moon, heavy weather, electronic interference, times when other pilots were flying blind. Stevens flew 14 patrols in November 1940. He made visual contact on 8 of them. He shot down 4 German bombers. Each intercept taught him something new about hunting at night. On November 12th, he learned that German bombers could be spotted by their exhaust flames, the Heinkel. He-111 had 2 engines, each producing a faint blue glow visible from 1,000 yards. Most pilots could not see it. Stevens could. On November 18th, he learned that moonlight reflecting off aluminum skin created a silver shimmer. A Junkers Ju-88 passed beneath him at 14,000 feet. The moon was quarter full. The bomber's wings caught the light for 3 seconds. That was enough. Stevens dove and destroyed it with a single cannon burst. On November 24th, he learned that bomber formations could be detected by listening. German crews maintained radio silence, but their engines produced a distinctive sound. 4 BMW radial engines running in synchronization created a low-frequency throb that carried for miles on a still night. Stevens would throttle back, listen, locate the sound, then follow it to visual contact. His radar operator, Harper, began to understand. Stevens was not seeing the way other pilots saw. He was processing every available sensory input. Light, shadow, sound, air pressure, instinct. His brain assembled those fragments into a 3-dimensional picture of the airspace around him. The result was awareness that approached precognition. He knew where bombers would be before they appeared. Harper started calling him the Owl. The nickname never caught on outside 604 Squadron, but it was accurate. Stevens hunted like an owl, silent, patient, lethal. By the end of November, Stevens had 6 confirmed kills and was the 3rd-ranking night fighter pilot in 604 Squadron, behind only Cunningham and Flight Lieutenant Michael Graves. The Air Ministry was paying attention. In December 1940, British intelligence learned that the Germans were developing their own AI radar systems. The Luftwaffe's night fighters were beginning to intercept RAF bombers over Germany using a system called Liechtenstein. If the Germans could build working radar, they could jam British radar. And if British radar could be jammed, pilots who could see without it would become critical. The Air Ministry issued a classified directive in early December. RAF squadrons were ordered to identify pilots with exceptional night vision. Medical officers were instructed to test all fighter pilots for dark adaptation and low-light acuity. The goal was to create a cadre of pilots who could operate if radar failed. Stevens was tested on December 12th at the RAF Central Medical Establishment. The tests lasted 4 hours. He was placed in a darkened room and asked to identify objects at various distances with progressively less light. He scored in the 99th percentile. The medical officer conducting the tests was Squadron Leader Michael Turner, an ophthalmologist who had studied night vision adaptation in naval personnel before the war. Turner was fascinated by Stevens's results. In normal humans, rod cells in the retina require 30 to 45 minutes to fully adapt to darkness. Stevens's eyes adapted in 12 minutes. Normal humans can detect faint light sources at 20/40 acuity in darkness. Stevens tested at 20/15. Turner asked Stevens about his childhood. Stevens explained the poaching. Turner understood immediately. Stevens had spent thousands of hours as a child and teenager in near-total darkness, training his visual system to extract maximum information from minimal light. His rod cells had developed higher sensitivity. His brain had learned to process low-light images more efficiently. The ability was partly genetic but mostly trained. Turner wrote in his report, "This officer possesses night vision capabilities in the superior range. Recommend assignment to duties requiring low-light operations." The medical officer concluded that Stevens possessed significantly superior scotopic vision, the technical term for night vision. The officer noted that Stevens's ability was likely genetic but enhanced by childhood training. Stevens was promoted to squadron leader and given command of B Flight within 604 Squadron. His flight consisted of 6 Beaufighters and 12 pilots, all selected for their ability to operate without radar. The press did not know about Stevens. All publicity about night fighter success was being directed toward Cunningham, whose cat's eyes nickname was part of a deliberate propaganda campaign. The Air Ministry wanted the Germans to believe British night fighter success was due to superior pilots, not superior technology. Stevens did not mind the anonymity. He was focused on killing German bombers. Between December 1940 and March 1941, Stevens shot down 9 more German aircraft. His total reached 15. All of his kills were achieved at night. 8 of them were made without radar assistance. On the night of March 15, 1941, Stevens was flying a patrol over the Thames estuary when Harper's radar failed. A power surge had burned out the AI Mark IV's transmitter. Stevens was 40 miles east of London with no radar, no ground control contact, and reports of heavy German bomber activity in his sector. He could abort the patrol and return to base. Standard procedure when radar failed was to land immediately. The RAF did not want pilots flying blind, wasting fuel, risking collision with friendly aircraft, or he could keep flying. Stevens had killed 15 German aircraft. He knew how they operated. The Luftwaffe's bomber streams crossed the channel between 2200 and 2300 hours, flew straight toward their targets, dropped their loads, and returned the same route. Predictable. Exploitable. Stevens climbed to 18,000 feet and turned east toward the channel. The moon was 3/4 full. Visibility was good for night operations. He reduced throttle and began a slow weaving pattern, searching the sky visually. Harper protested. Flying without radar was dangerous. They could miss enemy aircraft by miles and never know. They could run into enemy aircraft and die before they saw anything. Stevens ignored him. His eyes were fully adapted now. He could see stars down to 7th magnitude. He could detect movement at 2 miles. He could distinguish between aircraft types at 800 yards based on silhouette alone. At 2,234, he spotted aircraft below him. Multiple contacts, flying in a loose formation. He counted 6 bombers. Heinkel He-11s, heading west toward London. The formation was spread across 2 miles of sky. No fighter escort. The bombers were vulnerable. Stevens studied the formation for 30 seconds. The bombers were flying at 16,000 feet, 500 feet per minute climb rate, 180 miles per hour ground speed. They were heavy, probably carrying full bomb loads. Their defensive armament was 3 machine guns, 1 in the nose, 1 in the dorsal position, 1 in the ventral gondola. Stevens' Beaufighter was faster, more maneuverable, and carried 4 20mm cannons with 240 rounds per gun. He had 960 rounds total, enough to destroy all 6 bombers if he was accurate. He positioned himself 3,000 feet above the formation and slightly behind. He selected the trailing aircraft and dove. The Beaufighter was fast. Stevens closed from 2,000 yards to 400 yards in 30 seconds. The Heinkel's rear gunner never fired. Stevens opened fire at 200 yards. The bomber exploded, not caught fire. Exploded. The entire aircraft disintegrated in a single orange flash. Debris tumbled through the sky. Stevens flew through the cloud of wreckage. Metal fragments hammered his windscreen. One piece punched through the perspex and embedded itself in his instrument panel. Stevens pulled up and repositioned. The other 5 Heinkels had not reacted. They were still flying straight toward London. German bomber crews relied on darkness for protection. They assumed they could not be seen. They were wrong. Stevens dove again, selecting the second trailing aircraft. This approach was cleaner. He closed to 250 yards and fired a 3-second burst. The shells hit the bomber's port engine. The engine exploded. Flames spread along the wing. The wing separated from the fuselage. The Heinkel rolled, inverted, and fell. 2 kills in 90 seconds. Stevens pulled up. Now the German formation reacted. The bombers scattered, each aircraft turning in a different direction and changing altitude. The formation discipline broke. Fear replaced order. Stevens pursued the nearest bomber. This one was climbing, trying to escape into cloud cover at 20,000 feet. The pilot was executing a climbing turn to the left, standard evasion maneuver for German bomber crews. Stevens followed. The Beaufighter could climb faster than the laden Heinkel. He closed to 150 yards and fired. The burst hit the bomber's starboard wing. The wing separated from the fuselage. The Heinkel rolled inverted and fell. 3 bombers destroyed in 7 minutes. Stevens had ammunition remaining for 3 more. Stevens had shot down 3 German bombers in 7 minutes without radar, without ground control, without assistance of any kind. He turned west and headed for Middle Wallop. Harper was staring at him again. Stevens asked him to log 3 kills. Harper asked if Stevens was human. Stevens said his father would find the question amusing. They landed at 2319. Ground control confirmed all 3 kills. Observer Corps stations along the Thames had reported 3 German bombers going down in flames between 2234 and 2241. Stevens filed his combat report. The intelligence officer asked him to describe how he had located a formation of 6 bombers in darkness without radar. Stevens said he had seen them. The intelligence officer did not write, "Pilot claims exceptional night vision this time." He wrote, "Pilot possesses documented superior night vision capability." There was a difference. Stevens was no longer claiming an unusual ability. The RAF had tested him, confirmed the ability, and was now documenting his success. On March 18, 1941, Stevens was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. The citation was classified. It read, "This officer has destroyed 18 enemy aircraft at night, many without the assistance of radar. His exceptional visual capabilities have proven invaluable to the defense of Britain." The public never learned about Stevens. The propaganda campaign around Cunningham's Cat's Eyes nickname was too valuable to complicate with stories about other pilots. The carrot myth was working. British civilians were eating more vegetables. German intelligence was confused about British night fighter capabilities. And pilots like Stevens could operate in secrecy. Stevens flew combat missions until May 1941, when the Luftwaffe shifted its focus from bombing Britain to preparing for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Blitz was over. German bomber activity over Britain declined sharply. Stevens' final tally was 20 confirmed kills, all at night, 9 without radar assistance. But the war was not over for Stevens. In June 1941, he was promoted to wing commander and transferred to RAF Bomber Command. His new assignment was to develop night bomber tactics. If Stevens could see German bombers in the dark, German night fighters would be able to see British bombers. He needed to teach RAF bomber crews how to survive. Stevens spent 6 months analyzing German night fighter tactics. He flew training missions over Scotland, practicing intercepts against RAF bombers to understand what German night fighters would see and how they would attack. He discovered that the Germans were using ground-based radar to vector their night fighters into position, then relying on visual contact for the final intercept. Exactly the same method Stevens had used. Stevens wrote a training manual called Night Vision and Bomber Evasion. The manual explained how German night fighters would spot British bombers, how to recognize when you were being stalked, and how to evade once visual contact was made. The key was understanding that human night vision had limitations. Stevens could see aircraft at 800 yards under good conditions. German night fighter pilots had similar capabilities. The manual taught bomber crews to watch for fighter silhouettes at that range and execute evasive maneuvers before the fighter could close to firing range. The manual was classified and distributed to all RAF bomber squadrons in November 1941. It remained in use for the rest of the war. Stevens returned to combat operations in January 1942, flying Mosquito night fighters with 85 Squadron. The Mosquito was faster than the Beaufighter, better armed, and carried improved radar, but Stevens still relied primarily on his eyes. Between January 1942 and June 1943, Stevens shot down 7 more German aircraft, bringing his total to 27. All were night kills. 12 were achieved without radar. In June 1943, Stevens was promoted to group captain and given command of RAF Cologne, a fighter station in Wiltshire. He was 29 years old. His combat flying was over. He spent the rest of the war training new night fighter pilots and developing tactics for operations over occupied Europe. Stevens rarely spoke about his combat record. He did not consider his night vision to be special. It was simply something he had inherited from his father and grandfather, a family trait like height or hair color. When pilots asked him how to improve their night vision, he told them the truth. If they had not learned it as children, they could not learn it as adults. The medical officer at RAF Cranwell had been right. Stevens's ability was a curiosity, but it was a curiosity that had killed 27 German aircraft and helped shape RAF night fighter doctrine. After the war, Stevens left the RAF and returned to Northumberland. He worked as a gamekeeper on the Alnwick estate, managing deer populations and preventing poaching. The irony was not lost on him. His family had spent generations poaching on estates like this. Now, he was protecting them. He married Catherine Morris in 1947. She was a teacher from Newcastle who had served as a WAF radar operator during the war. They met at a veterans gathering in Durham. She asked him what he had done during the war. He said he had flown night fighters. She asked if he had used radar. He said sometimes. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. The eldest son, Thomas, showed the same night vision capabilities Stevens possessed. At age 6, Thomas could navigate the estate at night without a torch. He could identify birds by their flight patterns in twilight. He could spot deer in the woods from 200 yards in near darkness. Stevens never trained Thomas deliberately. He simply took him hunting at dusk and dawn, teaching him the same skills his own father had taught: how to move silently, how to watch for movement rather than shapes, how to use peripheral vision, how to let your eyes adjust naturally to changing light. Thomas joined the RAF in 1965. He became a pilot but flew transport aircraft, not fighters. Night fighting had changed. By the 1960s, radar and missiles had made visual intercept obsolete. Human eyes could not compete with electronics anymore. Stevens attended Thomas's graduation from RAF Cranwell. It was the first time he had been back to the base since 1939. The facilities had changed. New buildings, new aircraft, new technology. But the sky was the same. A young instructor recognized Stevens's name on the visitor register. The instructor taught night operations. He knew about Stevens from the declassified combat reports. He asked Stevens if the stories were true. Had Stevens really shot down German bombers without radar? Stevens said yes. The instructor asked how it was possible. The sky at night was enormous. How could human eyes locate aircraft in that much empty space? Stevens explained about his childhood, about hunting in Northumberland, about learning to see in darkness. The instructor understood the words but not the concept. Night vision to him meant instruments, radar scopes, infrared systems. The idea of using actual eyes seemed primitive. Stevens did not argue. He understood that his way of fighting was obsolete. Modern pilots did not need exceptional eyesight. They needed to understand electronics, computers, weapon systems. The human element was becoming less important with each technological advance. But Stevens also understood something the young instructor did not. Technology fails. Radar sets burn out. Power systems fail. Electronics malfunction. When that happens, pilots fall back on basic skills: navigation, visual flight, situational awareness. The same fundamentals Stevens had used in 1940. He told the instructor to never assume technology will work. Train for the backup, prepare for the failure, know how to fly and fight with nothing except your eyes and your brain. The instructor thanked him for the advice. Stevens nodded and walked away. In 1952, a military historian researching night fighter operations discovered Stevens's classified combat reports in the National Archives. The historian wanted to interview Stevens about his visual intercept techniques. Stevens agreed to meet but refused to be quoted or photographed. The historian's notes describe Stevens as diffident and uncomfortable with attention. Stevens explained that his night vision was nothing special. His father could spot deer in complete darkness from 200 yards. His grandfather could identify individual rabbits by their movement patterns at night. Stevens had simply applied those skills to hunting German bombers instead of game. The historian asked if Stevens understood how unusual his abilities were. Stevens said no. To him, seeing in the dark was normal. Not being able to see in the dark was unusual. The historian asked if Stevens' children had inherited his night vision. Stevens said his eldest son could read by starlight. His daughter could navigate the estate at night without a torch. The ability ran in the family. Stevens died in 1987, age 73. His obituary in the Newcastle Journal mentioned his RAF service, but did not detail his combat record. The records remained classified until 1993. Stevens was never publicly celebrated like Cunningham. There were no propaganda posters, no newspaper articles, no cartoons showing him eating carrots. The Air Ministry had decided his story was too sensitive to release. If the Germans learned that British night fighters could operate effectively without radar, they would develop countermeasures. So Stevens's success remained secret, buried in classified files that would not be opened for 50 years. But within the RAF, pilots knew. Night fighter crews, who flew in 1941 and 1942, remembered the wing commander who could see in total darkness. Radar operators told stories about the patrol when their equipment failed and their pilot kept flying, kept hunting, kept killing German bombers without any electronic assistance. Those stories were passed down through the generations of RAF pilots who came after. And when those pilots flew training missions at night, learning to use radar and instruments and all the modern technology, their instructors would sometimes tell them about Stevens, about the pilot whose eyes were better than radar, about the man who had learned to hunt in the Northumberland hills and used those skills to hunt over the English Channel. The instructors would explain that Stevens's ability could not be taught, could not be replicated, could not be acquired through training. But it could inspire. It could remind pilots that humans were still part of the equation. That technology was a tool, not a replacement. That sometimes the oldest skills were still the most effective. Stevens's story is a reminder that wars are won by people, not machines. The RAF's radar systems were critical to defeating the Luftwaffe's night bombing campaign. But radar required operators, pilots, tactics, training. It required men like Stevens who could use the technology when it worked and fight without it when it failed. The Air Ministry called his night vision worthless. They said modern warfare required modern technology. They said pilots who relied on their eyes were obsolete. They were wrong. Stevens proved that natural abilities, developed through generations of practical experience, could still matter in technological warfare. His 27 kills proved that human skill could complement technology. His 12 radar-free intercepts proved that the human eye, properly trained and naturally gifted, could outperform electronics under the right conditions. But more than the numbers, Stevens proved something about adaptability, about using whatever tools you have available, about turning a childhood spent poaching deer in northern England into a military asset that helped defend Britain. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about night fighter pilots who hunted German bombers in total darkness. Real people. Real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure pilots like Richard Stevens do not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.